to the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Brian Lomax.
And I'm Josh Berger. And today we have an interesting episode for you where, based on a listener question, we're going to be discussing how tennis players can do a better job handling their emotions on the court. So we'll start with reading this question. Again, just as a reminder, any questions or any thoughts about the mental side of tennis can be sent to tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. All right, well, here's the question. So, managing emotions on the court, specifically with individual youth. I work with competitive youth female athletes. I notice they all expect to win. When things aren't going well, they react negative, slap their knee, throw their towel, hit and slam the racket, and especially use negative self-talk. I find a lot of times they ask themselves, why? Why would you hit that? Why would I do that? One thing I've worked on a lot with them is developing and implementing a reset tool. That said, I'm curious on your thoughts about helping them change their perspective. I want them to realize it's okay to make a mistake, to mishit a ball, to double fault. Due to the high expectations from their coaches and families, it seems they expect to be perfect. Thanks for your time. All right, Brian. So where would you start from here? What are your first thoughts?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think there's a lot of good stuff in that email. There's a lot of things that I think we want to hit on. Specifically expectations, self-talk, perfection. But I think it really comes down to, I think it begins with understanding why tennis is such a difficult sport from a mental and emotional perspective. So I just want to throw out a few things, Josh, and have you kind of reflect back to me your thoughts on this. So I think if we look at the nature of the sport, especially the structure of the scoring system, we play a point and we stop. And and then we get 20, 25 seconds before the next point starts. So that leads to a moment where we get to judge ourselves or judge what just happened. And it might be, am I a good player? Am I a bad player? Was that a good point, bad point? I made a mistake. And so after each point, we're potentially judging ourselves, which is what we see in this listener email. I think also tennis is tough because the scoring system tricks you into thinking points are more important than they really are. And so, there was a mention of, thinking you have to be perfect. But you don't need to win every point to win a match. And in fact, Josh, you had mentioned this in a previous podcast episode, in one of Novak Djokovic's best years, he only won 53% of the points he played, which means he's losing 47 points out of every 100. Yet he does okay. I think many of us would trade places with him from a tennis career perspective, right? So, I think if you look at that under normal circumstances, you really only have to win a few more points than your opponent. I'm probably not going to touch on this today in terms of the structure of matches, but, because of how games are set up, certain points do end up being a little bit more important than others. So, for example, in college tennis, a deuce point there's more weight on that than, say, the first point of a game. Right? Would you agree with that, Josh?
Absolutely. Those no ad deuce points can be really a make or break in college tennis, and in more and more match situations now, that where it really comes down to that one point.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And how many times have we heard players come off the court and saying, "Oh, I lost all the deuce points"?
So often. I mean, I think oftentimes it's a legitimate reason. One of the reasons why they lost. Sometimes maybe it's an excuse, but it really goes to show how certain points are really really more important than others, and those few points here and there can really make a match for a player.
Yeah, agreed. So I think a couple other things to realize about points is that certainly that losing points is normal. I also think sometimes players get a little upset with how they lose points. Yet, does that really matter? So, for example, if I hit a ball and it goes over the fence, It's kind of an embarrassing error. Do I lose more than 1 point for that, or does that do I is it this does it count the same as by missing the line by an eighth of an inch? They count the same. It doesn't really matter. So I no disrespect to the sport of figure skating here, but this is not figure skating. This is the style and technique and all of that stuff. It doesn't matter to a certain extent. It's just do you know how to navigate a set in a match? Do you know how to get the ball from point A to point B the way you want to? Um, so, and I think our discussion of in episode 3, the stages of a set in a match and navigating that, I think that's probably a good thing to listen to when it comes to trying to manage your emotions. Because I think we did talk a lot about that in that regard. Um, so I think the last piece I'll touch on here, I think with tennis that makes it difficult is, and this is probably true of all sports, is the idea of expectations.
Yep.
Going out on there and having a certain expectation in mind, and so I know we were just talking about that. So I want to hear your perspective on the whole expectations thing.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, the expectations and a player as soon as they see the draw for the tournament, or as soon as they know who they're against, they're oftentimes players' minds go immediately to what is that player rank? Are they ranked higher than me? Are
Yeah,
they
what's their
are,
UTR?
exactly? Are they, oh, they're zero point 0.5 ahead of me on the UTR ratings, or this player is 1 point below me. And as soon as they see that, or maybe they see the player hit, or they've heard about the player, and immediately, oftentimes, players will jump to those expectations. That player is better than me, so I expect to lose, or I expect it to be really tough, or which I think is often more problematic. This player is worse than me. This player is ranked so low. Their UTR is so low. I expect to win, and I think those expectations lead to so many issues. When you're expecting to win, you're not going to be doing everything that you can possibly do to be a great competitor and to perform at your highest level. You're going to expect it to be easy, and as soon as you hit that first roadblock, you're not going to be ready for it. You won't have mentally prepared for that moment because you'll expect the other person to just lie down and make it really an easy day for you. So I think expectations, whether they be positive or negative, um, really detracts from competing at your best on any given day. I think a much better mindset to have is to try to go in and do everything that you can do. Try to control your side of the court. Try to play in your best possible way, and also notice whatever the person on the other side of the net is doing, and adjust to that and expect it to be challenging rather than setting out these expectations of winning or losing before a single shot has been struck. I think a great example of somebody who does a great job of this is Nadal, where anytime they'll ask him about like maybe it's the second or third round, and they'll say, what do you think are your chances of winning this tournament? And he'll say, hey, I'm playing this such and such opponent next. I know I need to do everything in my power to play a great match, or else I'm not going to have any chance. So he knows that he can't overlook anybody, even if somebody's ranked significantly lower than him. And I think it's the same thing. Anytime you get out on the court, having the expectation of winning or losing is oftentimes what leads to these frustrations as soon as you reach some pushback.
Yeah, and I think that comes with competing in an individual sport, maybe a little
Yep.
bit more so than a team sport, because I think the result is so much more personalized for us in a certain way, and and that might be why we are because I think our emotions are also highly related to our self talk, our beliefs, our attitudes, and I think that more of that comes out of that individual sport. This sort of tennis being a fighting combat sport, and so I think for everybody who's listening to this, if you've chosen to play tennis, you've chosen a very different or very difficult sport to play mentally and emotionally. So I think it becomes a challenge, throughout our lives to try to manage this whole process. It's not easy to figure out. So, Josh, when you think of because we're talking about managing emotions, what emotions are we trying to manage actually? If you think about it, what comes to mind are the emotions that occur for tennis players on the court.
I think there's a number of them. I mean, anger is a big one.
Hmm.
Players getting angry that they're losing. Players getting angry that they don't feel like they're performing well, maybe making too many errors. Maybe they're just embarrassed about the situation, what's going on. Um, I think anxiety and nerves are definitely a big one as well. And again, we talked during episode 3 about certain times in a match when players might be more likely to feel those feelings, such as the start of a match and such as trying to close out a match. So those are a couple that come to mind right off the bat. How about you, Brian? What are
Yeah,
a couple?
I like the ones that you came up with. I think, when we think of anxiety and nerves, to me, the basic emotion behind that is fear.
Yep.
We're afraid of something, and then our minds tend to look at the negative outcome or go to like we mentioned in that episode, loss aversion, protecting the lead, and so forth. I think resignation, giving up, that can happen, right? Depending on how badly the performance is going. 6-0, 4-1, you might be like, I'm out of here, and that's an emotion.
Sometimes referred to as tanking, right? The player
Yes,
gets to the
exactly.
point where they just give in, and you just see the quality of their play just take a noticeable drop.
Yeah. And even then, even sometimes it may not be super noticeable. I think anytime you have a drop in your effort level,
Yep.
whether that be physical or mental, you're actually in that tanking zone. Because a lot of players, and you've probably heard this, oh, I've never tanked in my life. Well, have you gone through the motions at all? That's sort of in the tanking response because you're not fighting 100%. Um, I think on the positive side of emotions, because I think there's some of that we want to talk about, whether this is a positive or negative, but I think confidence in itself I would classify that more as an emotion in a way. It's kind of a feeling, yeah, emotion. And so that can go up and down. That can get affected by things. I think a person could be calm. That's an emotion out there. They could be easygoing. Maybe they're joyful and happy, those types of things. And the reason I think it's important for us to look at these emotions is that, you and I are we're different people, we're different players. The emotions that work for me may or may not work for you. And so there's this concept in sports psychology that each one of us has different emotions that are optimal for us. And to give an example that many people I think would be familiar with would be Pete Sampras. So when Pete Sampras was playing on the tour, especially early on in his career, he wasn't necessarily number one yet, but he was a top 10 player. He'd already won the US Open. He had had a conversation with John McEnroe in which John had implored him to be more fiery and emotional on the court. And if you've read Sampras's book, The Champion's Way, you'll know that he didn't react. Not that he reacted badly to that, but he didn't buy into it just because that wasn't him. That wasn't his personality. And if being objective, Pete Sampras did pretty well on his own by being that calm player. But many times, and I'm singling out John McEnroe here, but there are other people who would say such things that this player needs to show more emotion. That player needs to be more fiery. And tennis won't be the only sport in which you hear that. But we have to know that that's not necessarily optimal for every athlete. In tennis, we've had players like Bjorn Borg and Chris Evert who have been extremely calm, cool, and collected, and yet were very successful at the top of their games. And on the flip side, you've got players like McEnroe, Connors, and even Nadal to a certain extent, who are much more about showing their emotions. Nadal more so on the positive side. Those other two weren't afraid to show their negative sides. But I think the distinction comes in is knowing, which emotions work for you. So if we were, I think instead of looking at positive and negative emotions, can we look at them from a functional and a dysfunctional perspective? And maybe an example of this would be, let's say you're a player and you get upset about something that happens on the court. Maybe you don't like the way a particular point went. And you're like, all right, come on, man, you can do this. And you kind of maybe talking to yourself in a negative way, getting on yourself. But if you're able to channel that into focus and motivation going forward, that to me is a functional use of a, quote unquote negative emotion. So in that case, it could be functional. What are your thoughts on that, Josh? You've probably coached some players that have been able to do that, and probably coached more players that haven't.
Yeah, yeah, we were talking before the show a little bit that in my view, there certainly are examples of players who, like McEnroe, are able to use anger and frustration and able to really channel that into being more motivated or more focused and more driven to whatever the task at hand is, to the rest of the match. Sometimes you'll see players who maybe it's a close line call that the other player makes. In junior tennis or USTA league or whatever it is, and they use that one call as motivation for the rest of the match.
That's
That
right.
I really want to beat this player. So sometimes I think you do see players doing a really good job of this, but oftentimes I think, especially with the emotion of anger and frustration, it ends up boiling over and players lose control. And rather than sticking to thinking about the playing style or the game plan that they have, or thinking about being aware of the player on the other side of the net and how they're playing and their strengths and weaknesses, rather than thinking about all these types of things, they're consumed with the anger and the frustration, and that's all they can think about. And their performance suffers. So I would say that there are I would say the exceptions who are able to really use those negative emotions in a fruitful way, you could say, and really use it to their advantage. But oftentimes, I think more than not, especially when people aren't taking an intentional approach to mental skills and to sports psychology, and they just kind of, they don't say, okay, when I'm feeling angry, what next, right? Having an intentional approach before it happens, but they just sort of let it happen and they explode. So I would say that oftentimes, unfortunately, I see players who they let these emotions get the better of them, and then because of that, their performance goes down. Um,
I was actually just thinking as you were talking, Josh, a wonderful example of somebody who was able to change this to go from anger being really dysfunctional and hurting his performance to someone who doesn't do that anymore is Roger Federer.
yep, absolutely.
I don't know that there's a better example of seeing it because he did it even as an adult. It seemed, I think it may be like the first 3 years of his pro career, maybe like 18 to 21, or maybe even later. His behavior on court was not very good, and I think you mentioned like sort of things boiling over. I think that's what we saw with a young Roger Federer, and then he figured it out.
Right. Yeah. No,
So
I think. No, I remember hearing. I think growing up, growing up, and then yeah, as you said, in his early career, he would show his emotions. He would break rackets. He would have these outbursts, but being able to turn that around helped to make him the champion that he became.
absolutely, yeah, and I mean, for you could obviously argue that he's become the greatest player in the history of the sport. I mean, that's certainly one of those great debate type things, and we're actually, I think, fortunate in the time that we're living in. We have so many great players. So there's that. So let's think now a little bit more about what triggers emotions in tennis. Because I mean, there are different things that can trigger emotions, both positive and negative. So when you think of that, Josh, what have you, in your experience as you've coached and worked with players, what have been some of the more common things that trigger both positive and negative emotions?
Yeah, I mean the first that I would point at is really as you said the tennis scoring system and how after each point you get that immediate feedback
Yeah,
whether you're a winner or you're a loser. And actually, going back to one of our earlier episodes, we were talking with Brian Barker how people take rather than focusing on the process and playing your best brand of tennis and becoming a better player, people take people they let that winning and losing define them, and so then after each point, you're either a winner or you're a loser, and you feel that way within your ego and within your self worth. So I think that immediate feedback and whatever happened in that last point can often lead to a lot of emotions. Especially as we talked about, if you have an expectation to win the match on a given day, and then all of a sudden you look at the scoreboard and it's love 40 on the opening game, and you say, this isn't the way it's supposed to happen today. I'm supposed to win. It's supposed to be easy. What's going on right now?
right.
So I would say the being a little bit too aware of the score and thinking too much about the previous point rather than having a broader perspective on, hey, this I'm going to be out here for an hour or two. There's going to be a lot of points that go back and forth. I'm going to win about half of them and lose about half of them. um, so I would say that devilish scoring system and those points that can swing one way or the other. How about
Yeah,
you, Brian?
yeah. I think we're also kind of getting at the one of the aspects of tennis that's hard is that this sort of immediate gratification versus delayed gratification is understanding what it is we're actually trying to win when we're out on the court. And I think we've mentioned this in the past. Points are a means to, you know, different ends, right? So points help you get to games, games help you get to sets, sets are what matters when it comes to trying to win a match. And we have to understand that losing some points maybe doesn't matter. The only thing that's really changing from point to point in a match is the probability of one player winning versus another. I remember telling this story. I went to a junior tennis academy some years ago, and it was a day where they were doing match play, and two of their best players were playing against each other. It was a 13-year-old boy and a 12-year-old girl. And the 13-year-old boy, really talented, but had some emotional management issues. The first point of the match was this amazing, probably 30 stroke rally that the 12-year-old girl ended up winning. The boy lost his mind. The score's literally, 15 love in the first game of the set, and he's already lost.
Right.
And I think very often when we see these emotions, we're acting as if we've already lost something, but you haven't. The only thing that's changed is the probability that one person will win the match versus another. And at love 15 in the first game, it's still pretty close to 50-50. Especially if the players are relatively even, don't you think, Josh?
No, absolutely, and that's a great. I hadn't heard that story, but I almost knew where you were going with that, just based on imagining how uh, uh, you know players oftentimes will feel when things don't go their way right from the start.
Yeah.
Um, I would say also, if tennis players oftentimes have almost a short-term memory in that they can only remember what happened most recently. So one example I have is coaching a player who they were up against a really tough opponent. And the first set, I thought they won the set 6-4. I thought they were playing great in the first set. Um, and the second set, they're down 4-1, getting extremely frustrated. And I go and I'm talking to the player. I said, "What's going on?" And they say, I just can't play. Nothing's working. They're clearly frustrated. So trying to say, okay, let's take a step back. First of all, it's 4-1. That's one break of serve, right?
Hmm.
So trying to have trying to, again, we talk about having the tennis IQ to be aware that just because it's 4-1 doesn't mean it's going to become 6-1 in 5 minutes. Doesn't have to. But also trying to have a long enough term memory to remember what happened 20, 25 minutes ago, right? In that first set. You won the first set 6-4. This is a strong player you're up against. What were you doing well that helped you get that result in the beginning? So not being so consumed with what just happened over the last 20 minutes, these last 5 games where you're down 4-1, maybe you're frustrated because you're not playing your best, but trying to be able to find that level of tennis that you were at in the beginning when you were performing in a way where you were satisfied. So I think not allowing whatever just happened in that last point, whether it's the first point of the match or whether it's some time in the second or third set or whatever, take away from everything else that's going on in the match.
I think that's a great story that highlights irrational self talk and rational self talk. So the
Yep.
player in your example, completely irrational at that moment. Like, I can't play or whatever it was. It was just things that were basically just not true.
Right.
And your role, you're coming in, you're like, Mr. Rational, and bringing that rational perspective, and really trying to reset him. And one thing that I think is helpful for players to understand is that there are multiple self-talk systems in the brain that are operating at any one time. And very often that initial automatic thought is irrational. It comes from the emotional part of our brain. And so, whoever that player was wasn't even thinking that. It was just like flew out. It almost would be like if I make a mistake, hit the ball in the net, I'm like, oh, why'd I do that? I'm not even controlling that, right? That is just coming out. And that's also a bit of what we saw in our listeners' email, that automatic, very emotional, often irrational self-talk system um, is it's the first one. It's also tends to be the loudest one. And for some people, it's the only one that shows up during a match. Now, another self-talk system is a slower one, comes from a slower part of our brain. It's more rational. And you actually, Josh, in that example, were providing that. And that's actually a great way to train players is to help them understand these rational perspectives so that they can follow it up themselves. And the reason I bring this up is that, like I said earlier, I think self-talk, attitudes, and beliefs are highly connected to our emotions. Very often, it might be how we're expressing that. And if we can learn to adopt more productive and more rational perspectives about the game, over time, we can train that automatic self talk system to be more rational, to be a little bit quieter, to let the rational part of the brain drive more of the decision making and the emotional management of things. But I think that's part of our role is to help them see that. So what are your thoughts on that, Josh?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's certainly something that has to be trained and practiced. I think it's something where you're never quite there, and you're always striving and working on improving it. I mean, we were talking about Roger Federer before, and I think we look at him as somebody who stays really calm the vast majority of the time. But I recall once I think it was Miami, and again, just the fact that I have to really think back to find that one outburst shows the vast improvements, but just having those lapses still of moments where it still does come out, that frustration. But I think back to your point, I think it is a skill that can be trained, and by developing the self talk over time, and by practicing it and having those positive examples that you can draw upon is just so important.
Agreed.
Um,
Yeah, agreed. So how about we let's move to some perhaps specific things players and maybe even coaches can do to help help manage emotions out there. And how about we start with some on-court things that that you think would help players manage their emotions better.
yep. For me, a big one is a routine. Having a routine that a player can go to after they lose a point. Maybe this isn't something that the player feels that they need after every point, or but maybe it's only when they really feel that frustration. But taking a deep breath is a big part of it. Feeling the feet under the ground. I know we're both familiar with the 16-second cure, but the different pieces of the grounding yourself and grounding yourself through the breath, feeling the ground under your feet, having a clear intention going into the following point, using some sort of self-talk to help pump you up for the following point, or to just reset that previous point. But being able to get into the present moment through the breath and through a grounding technique, and then being able to shift that focus onto the next point that's about to happen. And as we talked about, you don't have a lot of time. You have 20 seconds, maybe 25 seconds in between points. So in order to hit each of these pieces, you don't have very long to be sulking and upset about that previous point. If you're, mad and you're yelling at yourself, oh, I can't believe my backhand is so bad, whatever it is, within 5 seconds later, you have to play that next point. So being able to take that big deep breath and become aware of the moment and then move on to that next moment and reset is huge. To me, a routine that can be used on court, especially when things aren't going well. So in between points, but it could also be used during a changeover, in
Mhm.
between sets, if the set really didn't go your way and you're frustrated. That would be a big one for me.
Let me
What are
let me jump in on that because I think I'm in 100% agreement, and I think another way to look at it, Josh, is and research on in between point routines and just pre-performance routines in general show that when people follow them, they perform better. So when you don't follow them, the con the con of that is that you perform worse. And generally, when are the dysfunctional emotions going to come out? When we perform worse. So if we perform better when we use an in between points routine, we should use an in between points routine because we're going to
Yep,
perform better, which will then help us also to manage our emotions. Certainly, that space in between points is a great time to be going through all that stuff to make sure you're forgetting that last point. Our listener mentioned having a reset. I think that's a huge part of it. Um, I think, when I look back at my career, I learned a little of this stuff probably too late. Not too late, but later, probably in my late 20s. And so, when I was, late 20s and before that, my temper could be a problem. And I'm just going to tell this story, and I'll come back to why this is about the reset. And I remember about when I was 15 or 16, I was at a clinic at a local club, and I was just losing it that day, Josh. I don't know why, just yelling things, slamming the racket, whatever. And my coach, he liked me. He knew I was a good kid because off the court, I was not like that at all. I was just perfectly calm kid, but put me on a tennis court and I could behave quite badly. And he's like, Brian, man, you're losing it. You're just like, you're not playing well. You gotta figure out how to do this. And so I listened to what he said. And so for the next couple of weeks, what I tried to do is just suppress all my emotions. That totally didn't work. I just became this very sort of flat, passive player. And I was just sort of like, yeah, whatever. And that didn't work. So then I decided, all right, well, it's probably better if I act badly and still fight than just suppress my emotions and not fight at all. So I postponed that whole thought process to maybe closer to when I was 30, and I figured out it wasn't an emotional management problem. It was a focus problem, meaning that I was putting all my focus on what had just happened. I wasn't putting enough importance on the next point.
Yep.
And that is sort of for me where the whole reset button or reset concept came from, is that I started to really believe that the next point is the most important point of the match. So in that space of 15 to 25 seconds, my job was to make sure that I was 100% ready to play that next point. And that meant physically, mentally, emotionally. And so I started to develop a reset piece where I would say reset and I would press my vibration dampener as my reset button. And that paid huge dividends. All of a sudden, the temper went away. No more broken rackets, no more throwing them into the back curtain or the back fence. And I was just amazed because it wasn't an emotional management problem. It was a focus issue, and it was what I valued, what I thought was important was actually driving my emotions. And when I figured out what the right thing was, everything changed. I'd be curious if Roger Federer was a somewhat similar story or not. I don't know that. But I think that, when we talk about having those routines, within that, there has to be some sort of reset or however you want to phrase it, maybe just flushing the last point, whatever it is, sort of in that post point part of the in between points routine, you've got to dump it. And that could be from a positive perspective too. I mean, we talked about this, and I think in the stages of a set in a match, sometimes players get a little too happy and you ended up relaxing, and next thing you know, in the beginning of the second set, you're down a break. So it's really important that we keep the focus on that next point going through. So what do you think, Josh?
Yeah. I think I really like that story, and I think having something sort of a reminder. So having that vibration dampener that you can push in to remind yourself of that next point that is so important. You see sometimes players like Maria Sharapova, for instance, will be playing, sort of making her strings, straightening out her strings in between points. Also that term that you used, the flushing that previous point, it got me thinking of Ken Revisa, and who worked, he unfortunately passed away a couple years ago, but he was very prominent sports psychology professional that worked with many different sports, including baseball players. And I know a story that he actually installed, I think, a miniature toilet in the locker room of one of the teams. And so the idea is that, hey, we just made a mistake. Maybe in baseball you make an error, or you strike out, or whatever it is, and being able to physically actually flush that as almost a symbol, or in tennis maybe you find some other symbol like the vibration dampener, like straightening out the strings, maybe just even something like brushing off your shoulder and saying, okay, that point is in the past, and we got to be able to move on. So having a physical reminder like that is so important. And also every time you see that vibration dampener, it's even without having to touch it, it's almost that reminder to yourself that, of that mindset that you want to have, of not being stuck in the past and of whatever just happened and that frustration that comes along with that, but focusing on, hey, what are we going to do about it? What comes next? So yeah, I really like that story.
I
And
think you brought up the changeover routine. I think that that's actually a really good opportunity as well,
yep,
especially from. I hear so much about the idea of reminders. We talk about that a lot as sports psych professionals. Um, do we talk enough though about how to implement reminder systems? Because one of the things, one of the stories that I enjoy sharing with players is Novak Djokovic's press conference after defeating Roger Federer in the fifth set of Wimbledon 2019. And if we remember, he was down 40-15 on Federer's serve. He came back, he won the match. He actually won fewer points than Federer in that match. And one of the things that he said to me was really, it made me feel perhaps more, made me feel better. It was just like, it reminded me that we're all human, including Novak Djokovic. And he said that during the fifth set, he was having a lot of doubts about himself, about his ability to win this match. But he followed that up with, I just have to constantly remind myself that I belong here and that I'm better than the other guy. And the part about that I really liked is, hey, Novak Djokovic, he's number one in the world. He has doubts. He has to constantly remind himself to do this. Now, he's probably got a better way of doing that than us, because that's why he's number one. But could we help players with developing, say, a sheet or an index card of reminders that they could be making part of their changeover routine?
yep, absolutely.
So that, that they're starting to think, though, so in a way, in a college tennis match, Josh, you're there. You can be that reminder sheet for your players. But if it's some other event, they don't have you.
It's
And
true.
that's what I like, players to have either a journal or some sort of sheet of reminders, because that's their on-court coach. That's where they get to, get that Josh Berger wisdom, and they carry it out onto the court, because in the heat of battle, we often forget things. And one of my favorite quotes is from a English philosopher named Samuel Johnson. And he said that people don't need to be instructed as much as they need to be reminded. So people know what to do. That doesn't mean they do it. They just need to be reminded about those things. So I think that could actually be a useful means of putting into your changeover routine, because I find some players have in between points routines, but the changeover routine is weak.
I definitely agree. I think having, as you said, having those reminders on what type of mindset you want to have, how certain routines that you want to utilize, a certain way that you want to play. Um, Maybe even it's for a specific opponent and certain things that
Correct.
you want to remember. And it's the heat of the moment. It's 6-5 in the first set, and things are tight, and maybe you're not thinking about all those things. You have that 90 seconds where you can take a look, take a couple deep breaths, have some water, and remember. I really like that quote that you were saying, or that line by Djokovic. I think it shows that, and people often talk about imposter syndrome, and that even the best in the world, and I think that quote really shows it. Even the best in the world sometimes don't, even somebody like Djokovic, who has accomplished arguably as much or more than anybody in the sport, needs to remind himself that he deserves to be there, that he deserves to be in that situation. So I think that is an important reminder for tennis players of all levels that self doubt and that imposter syndrome are normal. That'll happen. That you will feel that maybe you're playing lights out, maybe you're playing great, and you're playing somebody who's ranked higher than you, or you're playing somebody who's has a higher UTR than you, and you start to think this person I'm playing is really good. I shouldn't be winning right now. I'm getting lucky, right? Starting to say these sorts of things to yourself. And I think recognizing that even, all the best in the world have this self-doubt, have this imposter syndrome that creeps up on them. So recognizing it as it happens and then being able to remind yourself, and sometimes it's a physical reminder, as you said, something you can keep in your bag. I think also having some affirmations that you can use for yourself, like, like, I deserve to be here, or I've been training very hard for this, or I've worked on whatever, my serve or my backhand or my volley over these last 6 months, and I'm really confident in it. But having things like that, that you can, when the going gets tough, you can refer to it, and you can remind yourself of these things. So I really like having that physical reminder. That's I think a great tip.
I think that also helps, as you were saying that, it combats or it refutes a lot of the irrational self talk that comes out because, like you were saying, like, or, hey, I've been working on my serve, or I've been playing well, whatever some of those statements are, some of those affirmations, those are inherently true. A lot of the other things that you might say, like, oh, you suck, that's just not true. And I think that those reminders can be a way to kind of refute or, counteract, counter argue some of the things that you might be saying out there. So, all right, that's good stuff, Josh. So, how now? I think we both recognize that there's probably some off-court work involved in learning to manage your emotions on the tennis court. So, what are your thoughts on some of that?
Yeah, one tool that I often suggest with tennis players, really athletes of any kind, is to use visualization. And oftentimes people think of visualization as literally just trying to imagine and picture yourself winning Wimbledon and sitting on being on center court, and you're in the grass, and you're ecstatic that you just won that match. And that's I think one of the things you want to do is visualize those positive moments and the positive aspect that could happen on any given day, and where you want to be ultimately. But also you want to, especially as you're going into a match, you want to visualize, and you want to envision anything that could go wrong, and something that likely could go wrong on a given day, and have a backup plan, have a plan B, have a plan C, so that if your plan A, if your game plan or the way that you generally like to play isn't working, maybe you're generally like to counterpunch and play from the baseline and play really consistent, and be fast and get a lot of balls back. But on that given day, it's not working. So you have to come to net more, or you have to go for your forehand more. So visualizing, knowing that that's your plan B and plan C, and that you may have to go to those options on that day. So utilizing the skill of visualization ahead of time, and dedicating 10 minutes, 15 minutes, going through a few scenarios ahead of time, so that once you're actually in that situation, it's as if you've already been. So I find visualization to be another great tool that can be used off court. And this is something that can be done in a high school or college setting, in the van or in the bus on the way to a match. It can be done the night before at home. It can really be done wherever off court, and it'll it pays great dividends when you're actually in that situation that you've rehearsed mentally.
If we go back to Novak Djokovic, he's a huge proponent of exactly what you just said. And
Absolutely.
if we go back to that 2019 Wimbledon, I think what we should do is post a link to some of the press conferences that he gave. There's the transcripts. He talked a lot about visualization in one of those. Maybe it was after his quarterfinal or his semifinal, and how it's a big part of his success, and he visualizes various situations of a match, and he sees himself getting through that successfully. And then when it happens, you feel like you've done it. You've rehearsed being in that situation, and that can also make you feel a little bit more confident, a little bit more at ease. So I think that's a really good way, Josh, because one of the things about playing tennis matches that often makes it difficult to manage the emotions is we don't always have as much experience in playing matches as perhaps we could.
Yep.
And we had this conversation with Jeff Barrett and Tim Donovan about the necessity of playing more and more matches so that it feels more and more normal. And the more normal it feels, the less likely we're going to get emotional about some of these aspects because we're used to it more. And I think your point about visualization actually can start to, pave that road as well. Is you're playing those scenarios over and over in your head so that when they occur on the court, there's no real threat there. You've rehearsed that. So I think that's a really good way of learning to manage emotions better. I think for me, um, I'm big on mindsets, perspectives, and especially rational perspectives, and developing, essentially what I call a personal philosophy. And so I want to help players understand how things really work out there. And we've gone over a few different rational perspectives in this episode today, but the idea of, everyone makes mistakes.
Yep.
Everyone loses points. That doesn't mean you're terrible because of that. It doesn't cancel out all the hard work that you've done because you lost a match or you lost a point, those types of things. But I think, one of my favorite um, mindsets to share is the challenge mindset, which is something that's been studied a lot in terms of helping people to build resilience. And essentially, the challenge mindset is about looking at situations and seeing them as a challenge or as an opportunity rather than a threat. And can we embrace that? And one of my favorite quotes around this is from the Toltec Empire in Mexico. So there's a bit of a Toltec philosophy connection to this. And I call it the warrior mindset, but it's really about the challenge mindset. And it says the difference between a warrior and an ordinary person is that a warrior takes everything as a challenge, while the ordinary person takes everything as a blessing or a curse. So if we put that into a tennis context, I might be playing you, Josh, and you hit the ball and it hits the top of the tape and dribbles over. I'm like, oh man, that is so lucky. And maybe that sticks in my head a
Right.
little bit, right? Oh, he's 40-15. He just won that game on that lucky shot. And
Why
now
does
I
this
get
always
off.
happen to me?
Yeah. And so but if I'm sort of that Toltec warrior guy, I'm looking at it as, all right, I accept that. And I'm gonna take on that challenge. I'm gonna come back from that now. And I think that if we can be looking at everything that's going on in a tennis match as a challenge, as an opportunity to get better, it changes how we approach stuff.
Yep.
Now it's about, hey, I want to play this match. I want to, take this opportunity instead of avoiding it, which often happens with some of our negative emotions. So that's one of the things I really like to work on with players to see, if they can start embracing those challenges more so. Okay.
And I think
Go
I,
ahead.
I, I would just add on to that. When you get to let's say it's the tie break, or let's say it's the third set, there are two ways to look at that situation. Do you look at it as something as a threat, or what's going to happen if I lose this match? Is my UTR going to go down? If you're in a high school or college situation, what does that mean for my spot in the lineup? Am I going to go down in the lineup? Am I going to lose my starting spot? So you can really view any of these situations as a threat, or you can view it as a challenge, as an opportunity, and view it as a way to prove yourself, to show how strong you are, how high of a level you can bring. So I think any situation, and also if you view it in that way, in that challenge mindset, um, in that type of way, you're going to be moving towards it. You're going to be eager for that opportunity to prove yourself. eager for the challenge. Okay, this is what I've been working for. Let's go. Rather than, I have something I could maybe lose here. I could lose my spot in the lineup. I could lose my UTR rating, whatever it is. So to me, it's also whether, to me, that shift in the mindset um, has the impact of whether you're moving towards the task at hand, viewing it as a challenge, viewing it as an opportunity, or being fearful of it and backing away and almost trying to avoid it.
Yeah. And I think you said that well there, that it really, it's a choice. Now, a lot of players may not agree with that. They're like, well, that, everybody thinks I should win or all this other stuff. And it's like, you get to choose the story you tell yourself. And that's a skill.
Yeah.
And it's not like you're going to lose ranking points if you're telling yourself an irrational story that works for you. It's really all about how you can, and let's go back to Brian Barker. What can you be saying to yourself that removes pressure? That's the skill.
And I think also, and again, this is easier said than done, trust me. But not not trying to lose sight of just the result and trying to focus on the process of doing it the right way. So saying, hey, it's a third set tiebreak right now, and I lost. Maybe you lost the tiebreak, but you stuck to your routines. You had a plan going into every point. You played calmly in a way, in a style that you wanted to play, but you ended up losing. The other player maybe played great, maybe it was came down to a couple points, or you were in that same situation, you ended up winning, but you didn't do any of those things. You didn't try to, focus on your breathing, knowing that you might be tight in that situation. You didn't go to any of your routines, but you got away with it and you ended up winning. So I think um, trying to help players try to focus more on that process and try to focus on doing things the right way and letting the results take care of themselves rather than just focusing on the results and being so consumed with winning or losing and sort of disregarding doing these things that we know and probably they know as well will give them the best chance of winning and performing at a high level.
I think the third scenario there, Josh, is you don't follow your routines or your process and you lose.
Yep, probably more likely.
And then that's when you come off the court with regrets. And the only thing you learn there is I shouldn't have done that.
Yep.
Where in your first scenario, where you're doing everything right, but maybe you lose, you can learn much more because you're actually pushing your game forward more. In that third scenario, the only thing you're learning is like, all right, that doesn't work, and I shouldn't do that. But you can push your game much more forward. Like, all right, this little adjustment here, maybe that, or you give credit to the opponent. And I think it's the more we can understand that this match that you're in is probably not the last of your career. Meaning that competition is hopefully for you tennis players, that it's a lifelong thing. That this is not the last match. This is not the last tournament. This is about this journey that you're on, that you are trying to master this game, mastering yourself, mastering this game. And every day we compete, it's about learning just a little bit more about ourselves, about the game of tennis, about the dynamics of the sport, and using that information to try to be just a little bit better the next time, and the next time, and the
Yep.
next time. Um, and so, even with respect to our emotions, the more I think we can be aware of that stuff, and the better. So, how about we
I
leave
would
it?
just one last
Yeah, go ahead.
one last thing I would just add on because I think that's right up there with the most important points
Mm.
that you whatever just happened. So we talked about those three different scenarios that could have happened, right? And maybe there's a fourth where you did the right things and you ended up winning. But any of those situations where maybe you, whatever the result was, and whether you tried everything that you felt you could and how you performed. I think another great skill that can be utilized is journaling, which I know we were talking about as
Yeah.
well, and being able to take that past experience of whatever just happened in the match, of whatever just happened this past season, and learn from it. Don't just say it's in the past, whatever, I don't even want to talk about it or think about it, but view it as seriously something that you can learn from. View it as if it's something negative, something maybe you don't want to happen again. How are you going to prevent that from happening again? How are you going to prevent that outburst from repeating itself? Or if you got really tight there, how are you going to do better in that next situation? Are you going to be able to slow things down, take a deep breath, use a routine? So I think having a journal that you can use consistently as you're competing, as you're training as well, and then you can look back at it, and you can maybe you had a tough loss, and you look back at your journal, and a few months before you had that same tough loss, or not the same tough loss, but a similar tough loss where something similar happened, where maybe you weren't able to serve out the match or whatever it was. And then you look back at the journal and you see that next week you played it in another tournament and things went better and you were able to utilize some of those mental skills that you're working on. So I think having something like that, having a journal where you can get your thoughts down on paper can really help you with that learning process.
100%. Yeah, I think it's a great way to build self awareness. And I think if listeners have questions about how to start with journaling or different journals to use or prompts, feel free to email us. I think, we both can come up with some recommendations on that. USTA Player Development also has a specific journal, which I believe you can get on the USTA.com website. It might take some hunting, so I could probably find that and put a link in our show notes. But I think that's a really good suggestion, Josh, for having people just begin to learn more about themselves. Because you hear about, oh, you should journal. But I think giving people some, like a starting point
Yep.
of the different things to think about or questions can help at least get you started. Because if we look at some of the best performers in any context in the world, many of them are journalers, that they have used that as a means of um, getting their thoughts out and bringing some more clarity to what's going on in their lives. And very often, as you're just writing something, a thought will occur that moves you forward. Where if you didn't actually go through that process, these things just tend to rattle around in your head, and they don't bring. There's no real organization to it. And I think that's one of the great things about journaling is it helps bring some clarity and organization to what you're doing. So, any last thoughts on managing our emotions? We talked a lot more on this than I thought we were going to.
Yeah, we certainly did. No, I think we pretty much covered it. I mean, I think as hopefully our listeners can tell there's a lot to it. It's I think sometimes coaches or parents will just say calm down or you need to get fired up. But the understanding that that is a skill, that managing your emotions and really training your emotional system, you could say, is a skill that has to be worked on and practiced. And there will be times and situations where you feel like you do a great job, and others where maybe you fall short. But learning from those situations and being aware of what your emotions are on a given day. Those are some of the big keys in my view of improving on that, so that you can utilize your control of your emotions as a tool when you're competing as a tennis player, rather than letting that detract from you. And some of these, as the question said, people having outbursts or saying they can't play, or so that these sorts of things don't happen quite as much. You have that skill of being able to control your emotions and being able to influence them.
Right. Well, Josh, thanks for that conversation. That was quite good. And for our listeners, if there's something that we didn't cover, or you have a question about what we discussed today, feel free to email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. We'll put more in our show notes on today's episode, so we'll highlight some of the things that we discussed. As a reminder, please subscribe to our podcast on your platform of choice. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're putting up all the videos of our episodes there. As I said, tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. That's the place to send us questions and feedback, as well as on Twitter. You can use the hashtag TennisIQ. And look for our next episode very soon.